All right, gang. Well, we have had so many requests for our next guest, and I can tell you, as a lifelong fan of Winnipeg sports team, our next guest has been the voice of so many of my greatest memories, both listening to games as well as tuning in for the sports on 680 CJOB. You know him as the longtime voice of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and really a staple, a Hall of Famer, and a legend in these parts. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome in Bob Irving of 680 CGOB, almost 5 decades as the voice of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, to Winnipeg Sports Talk for the first time. Bob, thank you so much for doing this, and happy holidays. How are you?
I'm fine, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Should I call you Andrew or should I call you Hustler?
You should probably call me Hustler. I don't think you ever really call me Andrew. But my mom does every now and then, but
Yeah,
you know how it is. Um, Thanks so much for doing this. With your retirement, there's so many things I wanted to ask you about your time as the voice of the Bombers and some of your Bomber memories over the years. But, considering everyone's still buzzing from the big Grey Cup win, I figured we should start off with the 2021 Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And, how about that finish out in Hamilton? Could you imagine a more appropriate way for this defense to win a championship than a walk-off pick with 3 guys touching the ball on the final play?
Yeah, and I think an appropriate way for the team to end what was really a magical season, Hustler. I was sitting there watching the game like everybody else, and when they were down by 12 in the fourth quarter, I'm thinking to myself, it can't end this way. This should not end this way for this team, because this is a special team. They've had a special season, and they were 11-1, had won 9 in a row before they dropped those 2 games at the end of the year that didn't mean anything in the standings. So they just, and the way their defense played, all the records they were setting and everything else, I'm thinking, if they lose this game, all the great stuff they've done this year is going to just be swept aside and forgotten. So it was perfect. And the West Final, of course, was sensational too, right down to the last play. And then the Grey Cup with the pick in overtime, and the unlikely comeback and the hostile environment they're playing in. I mean, it just all kinds of storybook stuff. You couldn't have written a season like this for the Bombers if you tried.
No, you're right. It was magical, and I think everyone that was at that West Final will remember that game amongst their most exciting and fun and special sporting moments. I mean, for your final official call on OB to be that West Final game, I mean, I don't know whether you had to deal with somebody upstairs to have the most thrilling, incredible, wild day, but you got. What do you remember about that last game, and what will stand out to you thinking about that cold afternoon in December of all months, where the Bombers booked their ticket back to the Grey Cup?
Yeah, December the 5th. Well, there's so much I'll remember about it. The pregame ceremony where I was put on the Ring of Honor, which is still something that I sort of can't wrap my head around, and it's so humbling. And then it was cold, and it's funny, the days leading up to it, Doug Brown, who does the color with me, and I were kidding around, and I kept telling him, Doug, I've always worked with an open booth, and it doesn't matter how cold it is, we have to have an open booth. So you have the ambiance of the crowd, and you don't have the echo with a closed window booth and that sort of thing. And Doug would say, well, what do I have to wear, a snowmobile suit? And I said, Doug, whatever it takes to keep you warm, just come prepared. So we kibitzed about that all week long. And it was cold. It was super cold. Fortunately for us in the booth, there wasn't much wind. And so, we were fairly comfortable, shall I say. And then the game, Hustler, I'm always amazed in these cold temperatures how well these athletes can perform. I mean, it was it was below 0 with wind chill, right? And then you got Kenny Lawler and, Darvin Adams making these sensational catches, and Collaros firing the ball around as if it's plus 15, And so I just remember all the elements, and I'll remember the crowd too. I mean, there were 31,000 people there, and they were having a ball. The atmosphere was just fantastic. People were celebrating and screaming and cheering. And so the whole thing was perfect. Honest to God, it was perfect. And then the Riders come back in that final drive, and you're thinking the same way with the Grey Cup. Don't tell me the Bombers are going to lose this game to Saskatchewan. That wouldn't go over very well. And then they make that great play to break up the pass at the end, and everybody goes nuts. And so it was really wonderful. And of course, it's the most recent memory I have of a Bomber game beyond the Grey Cup, and it's one that I'll remember forever.
You know what? I was going to ask you about the Ring of Honor afterwards, but you mentioned, did you know that you were going up on the Ring of Honor? I mean, I knew they were going to do something for you commemorating your incredible run as the voice of the Bombers, but when did you find out about that, as it were? And what was your reaction when you knew? I mean, it was about the greatest honor one could have being involved with this football club.
Well, there was a luncheon that the Bombers had for their corporate sponsors and major advertisers that Wade Miller asked me to MC. And I guess it was about a week before that game. And I said, sure, no problem. And at the end of the luncheon, after I spoke, he came up and announced that they were putting me in the Ring of Honor. And I was just, as Doug Brown and I used this term, gobsmacked. I couldn't believe it. Really, I had no idea. I was taken aback. I said to Wade, I don't deserve this. And he said, yes, you do. And so what am I going to do? I say no. And it was just, no, it was overwhelming, Hustler. It really was. And I never imagined anything like that would ever happen. And it was just, and I had my family there, my kids and some of my grandkids. And it was really a special moment, one that I'll never forget.
Well, and of course, I mean, everyone packed in that stadium, bundled up, ready for the Bombers to go at it with the riders of all teams, with the trip to the Grey Cup on the line. And you have this great ceremony, you're inducted into the Ring of Honor, and then you get up into the booth to call your final game. And the Bombers turned the football over 5 times in that first half. I mean, much like you said in the fourth quarter in Hamilton, it can't end this way. I think everyone was feeling that way, certainly in the stands, and I'm sure you were as well. But man, only being down 3 points at halftime after a half like that, I think everyone felt a lot of confidence in this team. But I'm interested in your perspective. Like, if that had happened, say, 3 years ago, before 2019, I really do think that the entire vibe, at least around the stadium, would have been very different. I mean, what do you think that 2019 victory did for the Bombers going into this season? And how much of this year was really just a continuation of that championship squad that was put together before we got into the pandemic and lost the season?
Yeah, I think what happened in 2019 when they had that run at the end and won those road games in Calgary and Saskatchewan, and then won the Grey Cup in convincing fashion in Calgary, I think that sort of catapulted them into a headspace where the players, and you're right, most of them came back in 2021, which was critical, by the way. They just felt, I don't know if invincible is too strong a word, because it probably is, but they just had so much confidence. And we saw it on the field all year. And, Mike O'Shea said repeatedly after that West final, we turned the ball over 5 times in the first half, but we were down by 3 points. And so, the guys are sitting in the locker room and thinking, wow, geez, we're only down by 3 and we gave it away 5 times. Why can't we win this game? We'll just go out and clean it up and come back and win. That's exactly what they did. And I think that confidence, that belief was built in 2019, particularly at the end of the year. And then you bring all the same players back with the phenomenal leaders they have, Hustler. I can't say enough about the leaders. And it all starts with O'Shea, of course, at the top. And then you've got Brandon Alexander and Collaros, who's kind of a quiet leader, but very much a leader. Jackson Jeffcoat, Willie Jefferson, and Adam Bighill. Wow. They have a group of veteran leaders who keep everybody in line and keep everybody on point and believing, that we're going to go 1-0 this week and all that stuff. It really, I've never seen anything quite like it. I haven't in all the years I've covered the team. I've never seen a team as focused and committed to a common cause as this one was. And, I think we saw that, as bleak as it looked in the Grey Cup, they found a way, and that was really the story of this team.
And I mean, I think back to, the end of the Joe Mack era and moving on into, another rebuild after so many disappointments.
Yeah.
And bringing on, I mean, Wade Miller, I think deserves a ton of credit for the way he's handled things as the leader.
Yeah.
I mean, Kyle Walters, the job that he's done as a general manager, I mean, you just ran down the list of players and all-stars that this team has that led to back-to-back championships. But man, Mike O'Shea has built a special culture. And I know you've got a special relationship with him. I mean, if you can, give our listeners a little bit of an idea about Mike O'Shea, the guy that maybe they might not see at the podium, often, saying very similar things. We're just winning the next game going on, because you would know that. And certainly we've seen Mike kind of be more himself once the job is done. And of course, he's finished off on a great note in 2019 and 21 with the Grey Cup win.
So here's what I'd say, Hustler. When Mike came here, I think he was, like a lot of former players, a little suspicious of the media. Maybe suspicious isn't the word, but a little standoffish, a little guarded about what he said to the media. And then they go 5-13 and 7-11 in their first 2 years. And that would make a coach even more kind of reluctant to open himself up. Then they started winning. And I think you saw Mike relax a little bit. The advantage that a play-by-play person has, particularly in this case with the head coaches. I spend more time with them. We do a daily interview and then we do a weekly hour-long show during which we get time to just talk off air about different things. And one thing about Mike is, you see these people and you think they're all football. Mike's not all football. He's just a sort of a normal guy in so many ways. He's very worldly. He likes talking about things other than football. The time we spend together, at least half of it is about things other than football. And he's just a real salt of the earth guy. And I feel fortunate to have had the chance to get to know him a little better than the rest of the people in the media, and certainly the general public. And I have all the time in the world for Mike O'Shea. He's one of all the coaches I've been around and the people I've been around in football over the years. He's either at or near the top of my list in terms of being people. You know what I mean? He's a great coach, obviously, and a great leader of men. Boy, I'll tell you, he's a great leader of men. And we've seen that now, the way he's molded this team together. But beyond that, he's a good guy. Hustler, you'd love having a beer with him, honest to God. And you'd get along great with him, too.
You know what? I mean, the times where I've had the opportunity to cross paths with Mike, it's always been a pleasure. You know what? It honestly does, is it game week or is it a day before the game, or is it in the winter at a Jet game, outside of the season, because he is all business. But you talk about that leadership and the connection that he has with this club. I mean, I'd be interested in your perspective on this. Can you remember a Bomber coach that had a more close relationship and was more beloved by his players over your time than Mike O'Shea?
No, probably not. Every coach has his own style, as you well know, and Cal Murphy would not have been beloved by all his players, but Cal had a style.
An understatement.
Yeah, Cal had a style that got the best out of them. And, I have nothing but admiration for what Cal did. He was a terrific football man. Dave Ritchie had a good relationship with his players, but it's really unique with us. Mike Riley, too. Mike was an easygoing guy who was a real player's coach, but it's just different with O'Shea. And I have a hard time describing it, but he'll sit down with these guys, and I haven't been there, but I've heard the stories with these guys one-on-one, and he relates to them as humans, and he wants to know about their family and what's bothering them or what's good in their life. And there's just something there about his personality that the players warm to, they're attracted to, they respect him beyond words. The fact he played and is in the Hall of Fame, I think, helps too. But it's the way he carries himself and the way he deals with people. And in the world we live in particular, you hear this about coaches all the time. They have to relate to the athletes today. And Mike relates to them in a way that is really, really unique and very special, and one of the reasons why they're so successful.
No, there's no doubt about it. Bob Irving is our guest on Winnipeg Sports Talk. Bob, I want to ask you about 2019, because, this was such a magical season, start to finish. And you beat up on the Ticats in the Grey Cup rematch, and you run through pretty much the regular season, clinch it a month before the end of the schedule.
Yeah.
And then you win the Grey Cup. 2019 was very different, and it was a very, very good team. Quarterback issues, Matt Nichols injured. I still remember being on the air as the trade deadline, and we got this announcement at 3:02 that the Bombers had acquired Zach Collaros, and off the cuff comment going, well, wouldn't it be great if the Bombers actually had to give the Argos this first round pick, meaning that he stuck around? That would probably mean something really good happened. When you think back to, to that season and where the team was, what they'd shown, but what they went through, the acquisition of Collaros, playing one game, and then that playoff run, where will that stand out in your career as, maybe one of the most special months in Blue Bomber history, especially considering 29 years of baggage they brought into that playoff run?
Yeah, well, it's right at the top. I go back to 84, Hustler. Remember, they had a 22-year Grey Cup drought in 84. And that Bomber team in 1984 was sensational. They had, I don't know how many Hall of Famers, a lot of them on that team. And so that was a very memorable moment. But so 2019, you're right, Nichols gets hurt and Chris Streveler takes over. And then, they don't play quite as well with him as they did with Nichols, because frankly, Strev was not as good a quarterback as Matt Nichols was. But, we all love him because of the way he played and the things he brought to the game. And then they acquire Collaros. And so I'm thinking, I remember back in 2014, 15, 16, when Zach Collaros in Hamilton was as good as any quarterback in the league. Bo Leib, I don't care who it is, Mike Riley, he was as good as anybody. And then the injuries and the concussions and everything that set him back. And his career drifted off, and the year he had in Saskatchewan, he was 10-4 as a starter. But they wouldn't let him throw the ball downfield or do some of the things he does well. And then they ship him off to Toronto. And so the Bombers acquired him because Nichols was hurt and they weren't sure about Streveler. But they brought him in as kind of they were going to go with Streveler. I mean, that was the plan, to stick with Streveler because he was giving them a chance to win. And he had that option of running the football. And Collaros was just kind of a nice insurance piece. And then Streveler has the messed up ankle, and Collaros is forced into action. And you talk about serendipity, or however you want to describe it. And you know what? It rescued the Bombers that year, but it also rescued Zach and his career, because most teams, I think, had given up on him because of all the things that had happened in the 2 or 3 or 4 years before that. So, yeah, it was. And then that run, they won that last game against Calgary with that throw to Darvin Adams in the end zone where Collaros does all the spinoramas and zipping around and everything. And right away you're going, that's one thing Matt Nichols can't do. He just can't do the things that Collaros did in that game. That's no knock on Matt. That's just reality. And then they win in Calgary, 30, whatever it was. I remember the game in Calgary. They're down at halftime, and I'm thinking, same old here in Calgary. They never win in Calgary. They're going to lose this game just like they do every. It's funny, these negative thoughts creep in. And then they come back and they steamroll the Stampeders in the second half, go to Regina and win. Yeah, I mean, that was the beginning of this, I use the word magical time the Bombers are in right now. But getting Zach Collaros was massively important to this whole thing turning out the way it has.
You remember, I mean, you just mentioned that pass to Darvin Adams in the final regular season game. And that, if you recall, was the weekend that the Jets and the Flames were playing in Regina in the Heritage Classic. And I will never forget it as long as I live. We were in, I don't know, a Moxie's or something like that. And it's a busy place. I mean, the city's pumping for this game. And it literally is half Jet fans and half Stamps fans. And people are sort of paying attention to that game, and people literally coming out of their seat afterwards, because most Bomber fans had never seen Collaros play. Like, wait a second, this is that guy. And I don't know what it was about that one play and that win, but I think it gave a jolt of energy to the team and certainly the fan base. But again, as you mentioned, those subsequent wins to get them to the Grey Cup, and then the win in the Grey Cup game, Bob, I mean, in Calgary. Yeah. They were an underdog going in Hamilton. I mean, they were 15-3. It was a hell of a football team. But I mean, the one thing that I will remember more than anything is just how the Bombers kicked their ass on the line of scrimmage on both sides. I mean, think back to that game. At what point did you believe, wow, these guys are going to get this done? Because they are absolutely throttling their opponent where the games are won and lost.
Well, I knew their offensive line was the best in the league, and their defensive line, if it wasn't the best, it was close to being the best. Although Hamilton did have a very good team. There's no question about that at 15-3, and they deserve to be the favorites. But, if you were around the Bombers that week in Calgary, you just got a sense that there was a real confidence. And a lot of the players were sick that week too. But I know Mike O'Shea told me, I think it was the Friday, which is the last full day of the practice week. He said he had to hold them back. They were so fired up and had just so full of confidence and desire to get out there and prove everybody wrong. And then, of course, Andrew Harris has the massive game that he has. But Zach Collaros really was sort of the key to the whole thing. And here's the other thing about him. When he came from Toronto, he fit in so well. And, Mike O'Shea knew him from Toronto because he had him in Toronto. Mike was an assistant in Toronto, Zach's first couple of years in the league. So he knew about this guy, and he knew he was a good guy and a quality guy and all that. But he fit in so seamlessly to their quarterback room. He learned their system so quickly. And the players all, were attracted to him and were impressed by him right from day one because he was a team guy first. And so, I mean, the story is almost too good to be true about landing him at the last minute on that trade deadline and all the great things that have happened since.
Back-to-back Grey Cup championships for a guy that a lot of people thought maybe shouldn't play again because of the injuries that he'd had. Yeah. And it's great that it turned out the way that it did for Zach, and certainly for the Bombers and definitely for the fans here in Winnipeg. Bob Irving is with us. Bob, you joined what CJOB in 1973, just a young pup reporter. What do you remember about getting that job? And if you could, tell us the story. I mean, did you go there to be the voice of the Bombers, or was this, in the contract they say other duties as assigned? Was this another duty as assigned that started this Hall of Fame career?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you how I got the job, and this is where fate intervenes in your life. And I've told this story many times. So I was working in Brandon at CKX, and I had met Ken Nicholson during the winter at a junior hockey game. And Fryer, as we knew him, was the guy in charge of sports at CJOB. And I got to know him a little bit. So in June of 1973, I have a chance meeting with him in the parking lot at the Grail Golf Tournament. And we have a little discussion. He asked me how I'm doing. I said, I'm doing okay, but I'm still looking for a full-time sports job. And he said, hey, you know what? A guy named Kenny Rogers just quit our department here at CJOB. Why don't you send in a tape? We had tapes then. Hustler, remember that? Days when we had tapes?
I do.
Send in a tape. And, who knows? So I send in a tape. Long story short, they hire me to be just a general sports reporter. But now my ship has come in, because this is what I always aspired to when I got into the business, was to become a full-time sports reporter, which I wasn't at CKX and Brandon. And then Fryer was doing both the hockey, the Jets and the WHA, and the Bombers. And there was too many conflicts. So they asked me if they told me I was doing the football. And, again, that's one of the wonderful things that happened. I was very lucky to get the job in the first place, to run into Fryer in the goddamn parking lot at Clear Lake, pardon my language, and then get a chance to do the Bomber games within a couple of years. And yeah, it all turned out unbelievably well. And I just feel very fortunate. I really do. Every time I look back, I feel like I'm so lucky to have had those things occur.
What do you remember about the first game you called? Where was it? And what was the week like leading up, knowing like, oh man, I'm going into Fryer's seat, because this is going to be the same thing that happens to someone next year on CJOB.
Yeah. Well, it was against Montreal. Dieter Brock was a quarterback. I don't remember the week leading up. I just remember when they said to me, you're going to have to do the Bomber games. I said, well, I've never done play-by-play, They said, oh, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. Okay. And then so we're doing the game, and the color guy's Kenny Payne, one of the greats of all time, and Jack Matheson and Jack Wells, who you remember, Hustler, two of the media icons, the biggest media giants in all of Canada, never mind Winnipeg, are also involved in our broadcast. So I just remember being so sort of intimidated by their presence, and kind of hoping that I didn't mess it up and that I could somehow make this work to the point where it would be acceptable. And it all turned out pretty good. But yeah, I was 24 years old, and yeah, super exciting. I mean, that's such a long time ago. My memories are a little foggy about all the details, but I do remember how exciting the whole thing was.
Now, what other question about the business in that? I mean, I remember getting an opportunity to get on OB and, really to kind of start to what I'm doing right now. And I had no idea what the heck I was doing. Vic Grant was maybe our biggest champion. Yeah. Kevin Lizard Wallace helped out in a huge, huge way. You were a massive help. And I also talked to Charles Adler a lot, who gave me a real great perspective on things kind of non-sports. Yeah. But I mean, looking back to you kind of getting into that, you were already a reporter, you get to sports. Who are the people in your career, whether it be at CJOB or elsewhere, that helped you the most? Or was there one sort of mentor or someone that really, really helped you become the man that you were and had the career that you had?
I can't say there was a mentor specifically, but there was a guy at CKCK in Regina, which is where I grew up and lived when I was trying to get into the broadcasting business, named Ron Barnett, who did radio and TV sports. And I would watch and listen to him all the time. And I'd think, geez, if I could ever do what Barney does, and I got to know him later in my career, and his nickname is Barney. If I could ever do what Barney does, that would be awesome. But I didn't try to pattern myself, Hustler, after anybody, or, I came to Winnipeg, and Bob Pickin and Don Whitman and all the sort of the giants in our business were guys you just looked up to and admired and respected beyond words. But I just tried to be myself. I described the game in my own kind of way, the way I saw it. I read a sportscast the way I thought a sportscast should be delivered, in my own voice and my own style. And that's what I tell young people in our business today. Don't try to mimic or anybody, just be who you are. I think that's what we all have to try to be in our business, because if you don't, if you try to do it some other way, I'm not sure it's going to work out for you. So I can't say I tried to pattern myself after anybody. I just tried to do the best I could. Let me put it
and the rest was history. Bob Irving, longtime voice of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers on 680 CJOB, is our guest here on Winnipeg Sports Talk. This team was so special. And I know you've got a great relationship with Mike O'Shea, and a number of these players, I'm sure, would be at the top of the list of some of the best Bombers we've seen. Certainly, we talked a lot about the historic nature of this defense. But Bob, looking back over your career, not including this present Bomber squad, was there a player and or coach that you I mean, if I had to ask you your favorite coach to talk to or your favorite player to talk to, and I know there was many of them,
Yeah.
who stands out on that list?
Well, it's such a long list, Hustler. That's a real issue when you've done something for almost 50 years. Players who spring to mind immediately are Dieter Brock. Dieter was an interesting guy, right? He was some fans loved him and some didn't so much because of some of the things that happened with him, but he was a real super guy. I got to know him pretty well, and I still communicate with him a bit today. Joe Poplawski, Chris Walby. There were all kinds of guys in that Bomber locker room who you couldn't wait to interview because you knew you were going to get some good stuff, right? We use the word good stuff in our business. You know what I'm talking about. Some good quotes. Mike Riley was a wonderful guy to be around. Cal Murphy was he was an interesting guy. I mean, and I spent 13 years around Cal, and I loved him. I really did. But some days you didn't get along with Cal as well as you might like to. But boy, he sure knew how to put a great football team together. Milt Stiegel, one of the all-time greats. I love dealing with Milt. Charlie Roberts, a lot of guys in the media, people in the media, I shouldn't say guys, Charlie, when practice was over, he was gone. But whenever I got a chance to sit down and interview Charlie, I loved talking to him. He was a really smart, interesting guy. And there's just a ton of them, over the years, and I'll leave some out. Tommy Clements came here to play quarterback. I did a radio show with him for 2 years, and then Buck Pierce comes along, and then Joe Mack here, and I did a 2-year radio show with him and got to know him. What a wonderful human being he is. And so, I mean, I could make a long list of all the great, wonderful people I've dealt with over the years, and there's just so many I can't even come close to naming a fraction of them.
You mentioned Buck Pierce. I mean, I was just watching him at that parade or the celebration and thinking about what he went through, as the quarterback of this football team with an offensive line. I mean, he must have been so jealous when he saw this offensive line get rolled out in front of Collaros the last few years.
Yeah.
But, to take over for Paul Appolise and to be able to continue it going and getting that ring. So happy for Buck. I'm glad you mentioned him. And I'll say this, Charles Roberts. I mean, when you go into the greatest Bombers of all time, I mean, his career, a lot of people, I mean, if you hadn't followed the team back then, I mean, you maybe not heard about him because he was maybe one of the great enigmas in Blue Bomber history. But as far as a football player, Bob, I mean, right up there with the best that ever did it.
Well, they lost that 2001 Grey Cup game, and Charles was a rookie that year. And I know the coaches after that game said one of the regrets they had was they didn't use him enough in that game. And then, of course, in subsequent years, he went on to be a superstar. He's one of those players, and there haven't been many over the years, who could lift the fans out of their seats. And Charles Roberts did that time and time and time again. He would disappear into a pack on a running play and emerge the other side, with his legs moving wildly. And this little guy, he's 5'7", 170, 75, and he was tough, Hustler. He was tough. I mean, he'd take hits and get right up, and he wasn't injured very often. He was a sensational player. One of my all-time favorites as a player, really, and I got to know him a little bit. And he's a quirky guy. Fair to say, Charles was a little quirky, a little bit different in some ways, not necessarily bad, but no, he was a dynamic player. And I go back to those Cal Murphy days where Tyrone Jones and James West and Greg Battle were playing linebacker. Those guys would lift people out of their seats with their defensive play, much the way Willie Jefferson and Jackson Jeffcoat and Adam Big Hill would today.
Oh, Bob, you mentioned that 2001 team that Roberts was on. And I think certainly people of a certain vintage or age always think back of that team as the best team that didn't win. But I would imagine that those early 90s teams, 92, 93, maybe 94, also in that conversation. The thing that was so different, I mean, I was younger, but I mean, you win in 88, you win in 1990, and they'd already won in 84. I mean, if you were young enough, you didn't really know of the 22 deficit. You get to be 9, 10 years old and they're winning Grey Cups and they do it every couple of years. But after that, how would you compare the team in 01 that didn't win to those teams in the 90s? Because I think that because they won in 1990 and then you had this 29-year drought, those early 90s teams often are forgotten unless you're looking at the record book and some of the players that played there and Dunnigan and what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, those 92 and 93, they were in the Grey Cup both those years, and those were sensational teams. The problem with Dunnigan was, as you know, Hustler, got hurt and missed some games. But when he was on the field, I remember the night he passed for over 700 yards. I'll never forget it. And there were only 25,000 people at Winnipeg Stadium. The game wasn't televised. It was a rematch of the Grey Cup game against Edmonton from the year before. It wasn't televised, which is unfortunate because Matt was sensational. But those were terrific teams. The offensive players they had, David Williams, and I don't know, I could go on and on about them. They were fantastic. And the 2001 team, remember, they won 12 games in a row, finished 14-4, and played an 8-10 Calgary team in the Grey Cup. And there was no way they were going to lose. I'll never forget going in the locker room after that game. And I've never seen a Bomber locker room where the players were not just disappointed and sad, they couldn't believe what had happened, that they had found a way to lose that game after the 14-4 season. So, yeah, those were some great teams. And people have asked me often, what about this year's team? How does it compare to some of those other wonderful teams? And I go back to the 80s with Tom Clements, Joe Poplawski, James Murphy, Rick House. Those teams were loaded with talent. But this team this year had some special ingredient that, to me, set it apart from some of those other teams, and of course they finished it off in the right way. But I go back to the O'Shea culture and the leadership and the focus and the never deviating from here's how we're doing things around here. And this team will always hold a very special place in my heart.
Well, and you will hold a special place in every Bomber fan's hearts. And I have to ask you just on this while you talk about this season. And I think this goes back to 19. It goes back to the hard work that was built, in the office. I mean, Carol and, and Wade, all these people that I just find that this relationship between the Winnipeg Blue Bomber club, the players, and the fans right now is as special as anything I've seen in my lifetime. Do you get that as well from the booth and just being around the city?
Yeah, I think there's a love affair with this team, and it's partly the way that they've sort of risen from the ashes. And Wade Miller gets a ton of credit for this. You brought him up earlier, Hustler. When they hired him in 2013, he said, "Okay, I know how we make this right, and it might take some time, and it might take some patience." And thank God he had patience, because after 5-13 and 7-11, you know what happens in pro sports, right? But Wade stuck to his plan, and it's worked out beautifully. And then the way they won in 2019, the dramatic way, with injuries to Nichols, and Streveler's got a broken ankle, and Collaros comes in riding on his white horse. And I think, people just fell in love with the team. And again, the way it was portrayed by Mike O'Shea and the class that they have in this organization now and the culture they've developed. And it's easy to fall in love with this team. And of course, it's easy to fall in love with a winner. That's the way sports works. We all know that. Wade Miller told me that on the Monday after the Grey Cup this year, they sold so much merchandise, it was in six figures on one day. So people can't get enough of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers right now. And it's a wonderful thing to see. It really is, because, and you've followed the team for a long time, they've had their ups and downs. And there were some times before Mike O'Shea and Wade Miller and this gang took over where things weren't going along very well. But you know what, Hustler, there's a core of fans here, and it's a large core, who love this football team, good or bad. And it's woven so deeply into the fabric of this community, dating back to 1930 when it was formed, that it will always have a special place in the hearts of people. But the bandwagon fills up when you win championships, and it's pretty full right now.
Well, there's no doubt about that. But I mean, I'll say this, and this even predates winning the Grey Cup in 2019, the job that they did to make the games more fun, to bring in younger people. I mean, I've spent my fair share of time down in section 140 and 141, and it's not just a bunch of 25-year season ticket holders that we're finally waiting. I mean, they've turned it around. They've made it fun. They've made it cool to go to games, and I can't say enough about what that's done. And on the other side of things, the players, the way the players have, they seem to be thankful to be Blue Bombers. I mean, whether it was started with, Yoshi and Hardrick jumping into the stands, or Andrew Harris. I mean, I believe, let me ask you that. I think Andrew Harris's free agent signing is probably the most significant free agent signing that the Bombers have made. I mean, culture-wise, on the field, we've seen what happens. Where were you on that? Am I missing somebody?
No, I think it is too. And his time was up in Vancouver. He wanted to come home. I remember interviewing him his last year in Vancouver. The Bombers were out there for a game, and and we knew that his contract was expiring, and there was lots of speculation about it. He might not be back with the BC Lions. And when we asked him about that, he was quite coy, but it was clear, as you read between the lines, that, return home would probably be in his cards right now. And, he came back, he was in his late 20s, and you wondered how many good years he had left. But man, oh man, he's been a big player in turning this franchise around. He and that Oak Park trio, the guys who went to Oak Park High School. But Harris his signing was huge. I agree with you, Andrew. It was probably, they've signed some key free agents, but he would be number one for sure.
Well, yeah, I think Eddie Tate, or maybe it was Willie J that coined them. What, it was the King, the Prince, and the Duke from Ed's piece and about the Oak Park guys, and that is special. I mean, that can't be overlooked. And I mean, I think maybe it goes back to my point about the connection between the team and the players and the fans. That is something that Winnipeg was missing for a long time during those lean years. And I mean, first and foremost, you got to be able to play. And man, those guys can play. But it really is special. And that's just another thing, I think, that connects this team and this community, in addition to winning back-to-back champion.
Well, and when the players keep saying repeatedly that they love being here, and part of it is that they're successful in winning, and all players love that. That's obvious. Mike O'Shea's a big part of that too. But, Willie Jefferson, come on down to Winnipeg. That was a very key free agent signing too, Hustler, I'll tell you. And that one, I think, caught a lot of people in the league by surprise. The Rough Riders thought they could probably get him back, but the Bombers did a great job of, working with Willie and convincing him that this was a good place to be. And now it's come on down to Winnipeg. And you hear all the players saying that now, that this is where I want to be. Stanley Bryant could go somewhere else, but he doesn't want to be anywhere else. He wants to be here because the guys on the O-line are all so close. And that's why I think they will get most of their key free agents re-signed, just as they did after 2019. Number one, they'll pay them fairly. And number two, they want to be here. They want to be around each other. And, you hear that about the family atmosphere and the players' love for one another. And you get a little cynical and maybe roll your eyes. But there's a lot of that going on here. There really is. And that's a big part of the success that they've had.
No doubt about it. Bob, thank you so much for doing this. Well, now I guess was Wednesday, was the Grey Cup celebration, was that your sort of final official public role as the voice of the Blue Bombers?
Well, as far as I know, yeah, unless there's something coming down the road. But no, I'm retired now, and I'm still going to follow the team and go to some games next year for sure, and all the rest of it. But I have no plans other than to be retired and have more of my own time to myself, more time to play golf if my aching back will allow me, and just to make my own schedule, I guess, in the summer, Hustler, where I'm not committed to be at practice every day. And don't get the impression that I didn't enjoy that. I enjoyed everything I did and still do, and I still love doing the games. Doing the games is the most fun thing, and that's what I'll miss the most. But anyway, I'm just ready to move on. I think you reach a point, I'm 71 years old, you reach a point where you say, look, I don't know how much time I've got left, but I just want to kind of kick back, and I'll decide on a daily basis. I'll decide what I'm going to do, and that's what I'm going to do, but I have no big plans.
Well, I cannot wait to see you at a game at some point next year, and just know that it's
buy me a beer. You're gonna buy me a beer?
Listen, more than one. In fact, we'll get you in the lucky Whitehead row in 141 right behind. We'd have to watch Hardrick or one of the guys jumping in after a touchdown. But no, absolutely, right. Bob. You have been synonymous with this football team for football fans for my entire life, and I just can't thank you enough for coming on right now. I can tell you within the chat with what we've heard from the gratitude and appreciation for the job you did, but more the person that you are. And, even in those lean years, how much fun it was just to listen to the games and listen to the coaches show and listen to the reports on OB. You were a part of Bomber fans' lives for this entire run, and you'll still be in their hearts, and we hopefully will see you in the stadium. But most importantly, congratulations on a Hall of Fame career. Incredibly deserved going up in that Ring of Honor, and have a great winter. Stay well, stay safe, have a great holidays, and maybe we'll have a chance to pick your brain on the Bombers next year at some point if you've got some time.
I think I'll be available. Hustler, thank you for those kind words. I really appreciate it. Look, it's been a great ride. And as I say to people, the pleasure's been all mine. Thanks for having me on.
Have a great Christmas, Bob. Thanks for doing this.